Hello, I am Ferris Saunders with the Racial Justice Collaborative, and this is Race as a Construct of Power, our Juneteenth presentation for 2026. When we call race a construct, what we mean by this is that it was built. It was engineered for a purpose. A social construct of nature, it was designed by people to fit a specific social niche in order to explain the world as we saw it, in order to help us interpret it. Race, like all social constructs of nature, such as gender, disease, or natural resources, it can be understood rather than just assumed when we reflect on social paradigms and how they affect us. On this Juneteenth, we asked a question that seems simple but cuts through a lot of the standard assumptions and half understandings that clutter most people's sense of this concept. What is race? Not what does it feel like to live in a racialized society, though that is real and very consequential, but what is race? Where did it come from? What are people actually pointing to when they invoke it today or in other points in history? To answer that question honestly, we will look at very early examples of recorded history and compare them to later examples in order to help inform how these different belief structures fall into place in different points in time. The biologically oriented pseudoscientific understanding of race that was popularized after the European scientific revolution is a very specific context in which race was categorized into semi-strictly, if largely inaccurate, scientific terminology and classification. And this was done in order to reflect the elevation of scientific explanation of the natural world in European culture at this time, as older mythological and theological explanations were beginning to fall out of favor as scientific explanations became more popular with the elite. The lens of this particular example of racial construct was quite rigid compared to previous classifications of distinction between peoples, as it attempted to explain what is a social construct of nature as physical and immutable objective science through the 17th through 19th centuries. Before this pseudo-biological classification of race, people still recognized phenotypic or visual differences like skin color or hair texture and things of that nature, and they still organized themselves into groups in part based on phenotypical difference, in categories which, for all intents and purposes, can be classified as races. Society still created insiders and outsiders with these traits in mind. However, like all societies before the scientific revolution, the most important distinctions were still mostly at this time cultural, political, geographic, and religious. And critically, these strata were highly permeable. Outsiders could become insiders and so forth. In ancient Rome and ancient Greece, the way in which their races were primarily categorized was by climate, with the known Mediterranean world being divided into three overarching categories, which could be considered their version of race at the time. There was the northern Germanic races who lived north of the Mediterranean Sea, which were shaped by their climate to have pale skin and slow, thick moving blood, which was thought to make them courageous, slow bleeding, and skilled warriors, though it was also believed that comparatively they were slow-witted and unintelligent. There was then to the south of the Mediterranean the southern or Ethiopic races, which were shaped by their environment to be dark-skinned, curly-haired, and have hot, quick blood, which was thought to make them wise and quick-witted due to the sun's clarifying heat, albeit timid in combat due to the belief that they lacked an excess of blood, which was believed to be crucial for aggression. The Greeks and the Romans, of course, considered themselves to be their own racial category in their worldview, and like almost all groups which created their own racial paradigms, they placed their own group above all others. The Mediterranean or Central people at the center of their worldview were both more intelligent than the crude, thick-blooded Northerners, and also more honorable and courageous than the timid, thin-blooded Southerners. Even with this racial worldview, however, in both Greek and Roman culture, the chief distinction that mattered between peoples was being civilized versus being a barbarian, which was a category that was defined by customs such as language and religion and laws and civic loyalty, not the climate theory and racial categorization of their own worldview. with it very much being seen as possible for those within the central climate race to still be barbarians, depending on their customs and loyalty. Especially in the Roman context, it was seen as very possible and ideal for outsiders who adopted Roman ways, learned Roman laws, and pledged civic allegiance to the Roman Empire, that they could become Roman citizens and rise to even the highest ranks of Roman society, as exemplified with Roman emperors such as the very obviously named Roman emperor of 2044 AD, Philip the Arab. After the advent of the scientific revolution in Europe, formerly nakedly mystic and religious European distinctions of race and groupings started to fall out of favor with the ascent of science being the new prime Western value. That being said, this newfound obsession with science in the West was, in many contexts, really just an aesthetic one rather than a material one, with all manner of pseudo-scientific explanations being adopted to explain many things in society, to provide modern ontological trappings to all kinds of old prejudice and bias, with many aspects of biological race being perfect examples of this false science. Famously, Johann Blumenbach, a leading race scientist in the 18th century, famously measured skulls across five varieties of humanity and places Europeans at the apex, providing the modern term of Caucasian to describe white Europeans, named after the Caucasus mountain range, at the very border of modern-day Europe and Asia. However, this wasn't because of any true scientific link between the peoples of Europe and the Caucasus mountain range, but simply because he found the skull from the Caucasus mountain range in his research to be the most aesthetically pleasing, far more so than the skulls of Europeans in his collection. Therefore, asserting that because Mount Ararat in the Caucasus Mountains was the mythical landing place of Noah's Ark, that naturally the Caucasian skull must have been the purest form of human, from which all other human races were derived. This is the origin of the term Caucasian being used to describe all European descended people, an arbitrary choice tied to biblical pseudo-history and myth, which were still extremely relevant even in elite scientific circles in the 18th century. Johann Blumenbach, perhaps surprisingly, wasn't actually especially racist for his time. He often expressed how, despite their degeneration from base Caucasian stock, the Ethiop or black race was quite capable of brilliance and intellectualism. But still, this aspect of his writing was not what would become famous, and his work would become the bedrock of countless amounts of racist pseudoscience from the time of his writings all the way into the modern day. Newfound prioritization of scientific explanations of the natural world in Europe was the origin of the scientific classifications of race in the 17th through 19th centuries, built purely around phenotype like skull shape and skin color. And this new foundation for thinking about the separations of people, as it came into prominence, it became applied to pre-existing systems, such as the triangle trade system of slavery, which had begun a century prior. The newfound pseudoscientific justifications that were brought about by this new rise in scientific racism that asserted that the white race was biologically superior and deserving of a role of leadership and even ownership over the inferior races, this compounded with the already massive scale and cruelty in the triangle trade and expanded it as the industries which thrived on the backs of slave labor developed. This would link pseudoscientific racialization into Western culture so thoroughly that any attempts to categorize race well into the future will still be built on shaky scientific principles and the assumption that race needs to be built on any kind of idea of ontological science at all. Basing their claims off of these pseudoscientific principles, enslavers and their intellectual allies claimed that Africans were naturally suited for physical labor, that their bodies were built for it, that their minds were less developed, that their capacity for civilization was less refined. They claimed that Europeans were naturally suited for governance, intellect, leadership, etc. Many race scientists of the 17th to 19th centuries provided the charts, measurements, and taxonomies to support these claims, and in the United States, many laws made it permanent. The 1662 Virginia statutes, the slave codes, the Three-Fifths Compromise, all of these embedded race, as it was being understood in this pseudoscientific context, into the legal architecture of the United States. By 1850, race and all of the legal and social weight that had been attached to it through scientific racism were being treated as biological fact all across US law, medicine, religion, and culture. The word race is used every single day by millions upon millions of people, if not more, to describe something they believe, they can see, and they know. So, what are they actually seeing? What are they actually hearing? What are they actually believing? What does the word race actually point to in 2026? Okay. When people in the United States invoke race, they are usually pointing to a wide cluster of things that have nothing to do with biology. These things are culture, music, food, communication style, celebration, spiritual practice, language, dialect, accent, syntax, tone. These are not genetic. They are learned, transmitted, and chosen. Nationality and immigration, history, religion, because entire faiths have been racialized. Islam, Judaism, indigenous spiritual practice, they've all been assigned certain levels of racial meaning depending on the society in question and in different historical moments. Societal position, which neighborhood you grew up in, which schools you attend, how you're policed, history, the intergenerational legacies of enslavement, colonization, segregation, as well as some degrees of phenotype, like physical features, skin color, hair texture, etc. These were assigned new levels of meaning by law and culture, but carry no inherent social meaning in themselves. The overwhelming majority of what we consider race is not in our DNA. Race is in our history, it's in our traditions, our customs, and the meanings that we've been taught to attach to these elements of our blood. Modern genetics have confirmed via the Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, that found that human beings share 99.9% of their DNA across all populations. There is more genetic variation within so-called racial groups than between them. Skin color, the primary visual marker of race in the United States, is determined by a very small cluster of perhaps 4 to 6 genes, and is one of the least genetically significant things about a human being from a actual biological point of view. The American Anthropological Association stated formally in 1998 that race is a human invention, not a biological reality. A person classified as black in the United States may share more genetic similarity with a white European than with another person classified as black, and the purely biological case for race that was proposed during the scientific revolution simply does not actually exist. And it never did when you actually measure it with a greater degree of real science that we understand in the present day. So, here is the question that always follows. If race is a social construct, if it has no biological foundations in hard science, then why does it still feel so real? Why does it still organize so much of our lives? And the answer to that is that social construct does not mean imaginary. It does not mean that it doesn't matter. Every law to ever exist is a social construct by definition, and they've governed pretty much all of humanity since the dawn of civilization, no matter where in the world you look. Biological race was written into law and policy for 400 years. Its effects in wealth and health, outcomes and incarceration rates and educational access, these are measurable and ongoing things. Our nervous systems learn to read race from birth, through media, through curriculum, through proximity and interaction. Humans are pattern recognizing animals, and we were taught this pattern. Although many of the concepts attached to race dating back to the biological races of the scientific revolution carry tons of negative baggage, because race is a social construct of nature, it will always exist. Even if we socially find ways to break past the old standards and deeply mired scientific racism. Some ways in which this has already been done colloquially is how, in terms such as Latino, which is largely nationalistic and linguistic in origin, has become racialized. It's very far removed from scientific standards of race, as people of all manner of ethnic descent in a classic pseudoscientific racial background can be found across Latin America. And even within this diversity, there's still a tangible utility in tracking this categorization because it affects how people treat people, it affects how people view culture, and therefore that affects what people actually mean when they use the term race. It appears in American census, taken alongside the more classic categories of race simultaneously. Is this strictly correct? Is this strictly incorrect? The true answer is that there is no strictly correct answer, any more than you can strictly classify if a plant is a plant or a weed. It's a social utility. It matters for how we're trying to define something in the moment in the culture. Race is an evolving social construct, and the only way in which we know it's real is not because of DNA markers or genetics, but because it feels real. Different explanations and values for race have always existed throughout history and have come and gone through the different eras. Biological race was invented to give a new explanation and context to different peoples of the world at a time in Europe when the aesthetics of the old explanations were beginning to fall out of favor. Along the way, after its construction, scientific race was used to better serve an economy built on forced labor. Scientific and naturalist legitimacy were used to reinforce deeply cruel dynamics. It was embedded so deeply into law, culture, and daily life that it began to feel like nature itself. It is not nature, it is history, and history can be learned, understood, and folded into a wider understanding. Again, thank you. My name is Farrah Saunders with the Racial Justice Collaborative, and we appreciate you coming to our Juneteenth 2026 presentation.